Hello and welcome to East West Center Research Program Speaker Series, the monthly event where we invite speakers from across the Asia Pacific to talk about social, economic, political, and environmental processes that are shaping the region in profound ways. We are fortunate to have with us Pradeep Priyadarshini, Head of Learning uh, Measurement and Evaluation at the Foundation for Ecological Security, one of the leading environmental nonprofits in India. She has worked for over 10 years at the intersection of research, practice, and policy on issues pertaining to natural resource management in India. Her work is focused on long-term social ecological monitoring, building evidence on the significance of common pool resources for the rural household, and on strengthening collective action for the governance of shared natural resources. So welcome, Prathiti. Before I turn over the floor to Prathiti, just one small note on logistics. Please post your questions in the Q&A box and I shall convey them to the speaker. Now, without further ado, Prathiti, it's over to you.
Thank you, Sandeep. And I welcome all of you to this series. I hope it's a good session for an interactive session for all of us. I'll just begin sharing my screen. So in this presentation, I'll be sharing about some of our experiences from the field of working with village communities in different geographies of India towards commoning and towards improving the governance of commons or shared natural resources. So I'll begin by giving you the larger context of India, and then moving on to just briefly about FES, what we do, what is our approach, the core model, and talking about some of the impact or stories of change that we see on the ground, and then moving on to way forward. So when we look at the larger context, environmental degradation is a massive problem in the Indian context. Nearly 30% of our landmass is degraded. 54% of our country faces high to extremely high water stress situations. And this is severely impacting the farm-based livelihoods, the agriculture and livestock keeping communities, and the tribal communities or indigenous communities in different parts of India. The per capita availability of land has been declining over the decades, and it's projected to further decline. There is also an increase in the number of people who are migrating from rural to urban areas. Many of these migration can be also attributed to distress migration, which is because of the depleting or the declining livelihoods of communities in these regions. And this challenge further exacerbates in the context of climate change, wherein say extreme temperatures and drought-like situations increases the risks that farmers face in terms of the kind of production or the productivity that they would get from the crops. So as per a World Bank report, nearly 600 million Indians are to be moderately or severely affected from climate change, and most affected will be the rural households who are dependent on farm-based livelihoods. Now, when we look at the total geographical area of India, nearly 25% of India's landmass, or 205 million acres, are constituted by commons. Commons are shared natural resources, for example, community forests, pastures, water bodies, and nearly 350 million rural poor are directly dependent on these resources for meeting their basic livelihood needs of food, fodder, timber, water. And these lands or these resources are also very important for the ecological services that they provide. So many of these lands, they are catchments for water sources. They provide habitats for pollinators, for pest predators. They regulate the nutrient cycle. They help in maintaining the water flows. So they are critical, and they provide the very foundation for the agriculture and livestock production systems on which many of our rural communities are directly dependent on. Now, besides the ecological and economic value, they are also very important for the social and cultural values that these resources provide. So many of these lands are like sacred groves. They provide the social identity and the cultural identity of communities are attached to these resources. So you would find a lot of villages being named after some of these forests and what bodies that is there in the village. And the recent studies that have been undertaken, they estimate that the annual economic value of commons of all the ecological services and functions and services that it provides, it can be estimated at 90 billion US dollars annually, which is roughly 3% of the national GDP, although it's not formally accounted in our system. But despite the significance, what we also see that nearly 31 to 55% of these common lands have declined over the past 50 years, which is resulting in a lot of biodiversity loss, land degradation, and it's aggravating the problems of acute water scarcity. And some of the primary reasons for this is one, people's rights, the local communities' rights on these resources who are directly dependent on these resources and have been managing these resources for several generations through their local rules and regulations. Their rights on these resources are not generally formally recognized. Secondly, the capacity or the belief, the faith in the capacity of rural communities to manage their resources on their own is not there. So what has happened over the years is that a lot of parallel set of institutions have been set up, which are inferior to the local institutional arrangements or institutions that the communities had evolved over generations for managing these resources. And thirdly, these lands, common lands, are, since the economic value or the ecological value is often not recognized, it goes unnoticed. These lands are often also termed as wastelands, so diverted to other purposes which are more productive in nature. That's the entire thing. So it is in this larger context that Foundation for Ecological Security, FES, which is an NGO, we are operating. So our mission is to conserve nature and natural resources by catalyzing informed and collaborative action amongst local communities, practitioners, government, and academicians for improving the economic opportunities of rural communities, as well as for the social and ecological well-being. So together with our partners, so we are working with more than 100 NGOs right now, and in more than have partnerships with more than 7 state governments. So we are working across 14 states in India, and together we are reaching out to some more than 40,000 villages, influencing or impacting the lives of nearly 25 million people who are managing their resources, their forests, their pastures through locally established rules and regulations. Now, where we work is, these are areas that are environmentally vulnerable regions. They're where the production systems are on the edge. These are they are mostly dependent on rain-fed agriculture, which means one cropping season a year. So they would be able to grow crops only during the rainy season, which lasts for, say, about 3 to 4 months a year. And the rest of the year, they would have to depend on some other sources of livelihoods. These areas are homes to small and marginal farmers. They are homes to indigenous communities, agro-pastoralist communities. And over the years, what we've seen is that there has been a lot of erosion of the indigenous knowledge systems and institutions that communities had for governing these natural resources. Commons are an important part of the landscape, and it contributes to nearly 20 to 40% of the annual household income of the rural households in these regions. Now, our approach, it's largely, we have three basic things in our approach. So one is systems thinking. We understand and we acknowledge that humans are just one part of the larger ecosystem. We are just one of the living beings. And what we do is deeply interconnected with other living beings, with the social systems, with the ecological systems of which we are part of. So unlike a lot of other agencies which would say focus either on the economic aspect or on the social aspect or on the conservation side. We believe that ecological priorities needs to be seen alongside the social and economic agenda. And all these three things are interconnected: economic system, social system, ecological systems. Human nature relationships are mediated by institutions, by policies, by laws. So our approach is largely guided by systems thinking, going beyond reductionism and beyond the linear agenda of looking at just meeting short-term requirements. Secondly, we work on a landscape approach wherein we recognize that forest, land, water, they exist in a continuum. So in the rural context, when we look at soil, moisture, nutrients, biodiversity, these are like the biophysical infrastructure in a rural context, and they are the systemic drivers. So if we're working towards ecological restoration, the effort is towards improving the performance or to improving the condition of these systemic drivers so that the benefits can be reached into ecological, social, and economic domains. We see commons both as a resource system as well as an institutional system to be like a singular platform which has the potential to address issues concerning to poverty reduction, equity, because these commons are also spaces for negotiation, for contestation by especially women and the marginalized communities, and also for improving the ecological health. Thirdly, what we believe is in our approach is largely also guided by the belief in community institutions and collective action as the social infrastructure. So what we have learned over the years is also that collective action, which is based on, say, a code of locally agreed norms, it also keeps individual greed in check. So, for example, if in a village, there would be people who would be over-harvesting from the forest or who would be drilling deeper and deeper into the aquifers to extract groundwater from their well. If there is strong collective action in the village, then that keeps that dominant or that powerful farmer to stop over extracting groundwater from the aquifers. Secondly, this collective action, it also mediates the interaction between the natural and human systems by crafting and monitoring rules for resource usage, for resource appropriation, and all. So what we essentially do across all the villages along with our partners is work on three interconnected aspects of securing community land rights, enhancing collective action for inclusive management and governance, and thirdly, improving rural communities' access to resources and finances for restoration. So secure community land rights, this provides, and there are several evidences both in research as well as in the practice domain, which shows that when communities have secure tenure on their resources, there's a higher incentive for them to manage and to protect their resources. So they're able to make long-term investments as well as benefit from the investments that they've made in these resources. And when I say investments, it's not just financial investments, but also investments in terms of their energies, their times, in terms of protecting or managing their natural resources. Secondly, along with rights comes responsibilities. So a lot of focus is on strengthening rules and regulations for inclusively and responsibly managing these natural resources. And thirdly, since many of these landscapes are in a degraded condition, which requires some sort of biophysical initiatives to be undertaken, we also assist communities in accessing resources and finances from different programs and schemes, including government programs to restore their landscapes. And together, when we work on these three components, we see that there is improved ecological health, which also helps in strengthening the resilience of rural livelihoods. So going on to each of these three components, what we do in while working on securing land rights is, so basically when we look at the different types of common lands, there are forests, there are pastures, there are the so-called wastelands. And all of these lands, technically, as per law, they are under the jurisdiction of different government departments. So all of these lands have different processes through which communities can secure their rights over these lands. And often these processes are so complex, the legal processes, that communities do not have adequate information or awareness about how do they secure their rights on these lands. So a lot of the effort is on ensuring how do we enable community-led processes for mapping of these resources, because many a times the boundaries of these resources are not very clear. There would be contestations from neighboring villages, from within the community, from other stakeholders. So we assist them in mapping their commons through different kinds of methods and tools. Now, also providing them platform for contestation and negotiation. So the customary users or neighboring villages, they would come to a common platform and they would contest whose lands are these, who has rights, who does not have rights, what has been the role of each of the communities in conserving these lands in traditionally, and then helping them to submit their claims to different government departments depending on the land category that is there, so that those claims can be recognized as rights. What we also do is enable their capacities to negotiate with the government departments to ensure that these claims are recognized in a timely manner and their rights to these resources are recognized. Secondly, on the collective action part, so we have a lot of faith in the local wisdom and knowledge, while at the same time we challenge them on issues of equity. So how equitable these rules are, these local rules are. So we would challenge them on those issues, but at the same time we would also strengthen and we would try to understand what are those local rules and regulations that their communities have had for generations, which might have eroded over time. Secondly, also understanding their what is their worldview and what is their understanding of the ecological condition in their village. What are the different kinds of species that used to grow in their village for historically, and so building on their local wisdom and knowledge, and engaging with them to craft and to strengthen local rules and regulations for managing and strengthening the governance of these commons through by constituting different kinds of village institutions which are based on principles of universal membership and that provide spaces for poor, for women, for indigenous communities to voice their concerns, to assert their rights, and to assert their voices in these. And these institutions that we work on, it's not just at one level, that is not just at the village level, but we also help in villages in connecting to each other and trying to evolve some sort of polycentric governance arrangements wherein you have institutions at different levels from village to a larger landscape level. And how do we improve coordination and communication between these village institutions? Thirdly, the focus is on ecological restoration. So we strongly believe that in nature's potential to heal itself. So there's a lot of focus on how do you strengthen the institutional mechanisms for managing or restoring these lands so that the nature restores itself. There's a lot of focus on growing mixed variety of indigenous species of trees, grasses. There also we use different kinds of methods and tools to trigger discussions around that can help in understanding the threshold limits of that particular ecosystem. So these are some of the impacts that we see. This is a common land in a village in southern part of India. So we see 16 years down down the line. And this is a very rocky terrain. This is another village in the western part of India, in Gujarat, wherein we work with the communities to restore this land. And this change, it manifests in improved ecological, social, and economic outcomes. So we see that over a period of, say, 5 to 7 years, there is improvement in the biomass improves by almost 2.6 times, and there's a higher carbon stock. So with improved vegetative condition, the soil moisture regime improves, there is more vegetation, there's a higher floral and faunal diversity. There's improvement in the water table. There's improvement in soil organic carbon, and in the long run, it also means that it provides a better habitat for pollinators, for pest predators who are like the best friends of farmers. Secondly, what we also see is thousands of community stewards emerging in these areas. So a lot of local leaders, women and men leaders, asserting their voice, the agency, the power. So that strengthens over a period of time. There is stronger collective action. Communities are more cohesive. Their negotiating power improves. They start engaging with a lot of other external actors, ensuring that they get access not just to resources for restoring the landscape, but also to different kinds of government programs and schemes for the development of their village. So there is a lot of spin-offs also that we see. And on the economic side, what we see is that with strong collective action and improved resource base, the household income increases because of one, improved crop productivity. Secondly, since many of these, as I shared earlier, are in rain-fed regions wherein they're able to take crop in just one season, improved water availability and improved soil moisture regime helps in increasing the double cropping area. So we see like a 78% increase in the double cropping area. And with more of water fodder available, the livestock holding of communities also increases. So this is over a period of 5 to 7 years that we see these kind of changes. At the landscape level, using GIS and remote sensing, we've been tracking some of the watersheds, which typically spans across 5,000 hectares. And what we see is that over a period of time, the so-called wastelands, shrublands, their area starts reducing, and the area of forest cover and area under double crop starts increasing over a period of time. And when you ground truth it with field-based data, what we see is that there is improved biomass availability on commons, where communities have secure rights and which are regenerated, which also helps in improving the water flows. And there is even in times of drought, like the graph that you see on the bottom left, you see that even in times where there were low rainfalls, because of the availability of water and fodder for the livestock, the milk sale from the cattle continued to be, it was not as impacted as it would have had the commons in their region being degraded. So in that sense, it also helps in strengthening the resilience of these rural communities. So overall, what we see is that by working on the aspects of institutional strengthening and on improving the ecological conditions, so these two aspects, they contribute to improving the agriculture and livestock-based production systems. The linkages between agriculture and livestock also strengthens, because the fodder from crop residues and the manure from the livestock, they feed into each other. So there is a lot of these interactions or connections that have broken because of resource degradation in the past. We see that these connections are revived and they are restored. And this contributes to more of income. So improved resource condition also contributes to more of NTFPs, or say in terms of fruits, flowers, seeds, leaves being obtained from the forest. And with better negotiating powers of the village communities, they are able to have access to government programs and schemes. They're able to access the government to get education facilities, hospital facilities. They're able to engage with the panchayats to pressurize them to have access to roads and all also in their area. But the question is this sufficient? And are we able to create an enduring impact? So we have been in this sector for about 3 decades now, but so far, as you see, that we were able to make a difference to only 12 million acres of land, while the ask is for 205 million acres, which is nearly one-fourth of India. So in the last few years, what we've done is we've tried to we reflected, we went back to the blackboard to see what is the really the problem that we're dealing with, and how do we address this kind of a systemic issue. So there's a short film that we have, and I would request Alicia to share that video, and then we'll get on to the Q&A.
The promise of commons. Commons are community forests, pastures, and water bodies. They cover 25% of India's landmass. 350 million people depend on commons for their livelihoods. It helps rural people, especially women, meet basic needs of food, fodder, medicine, firewood, and timber. It is a critical source of income and sustenance for tribal populations, 45% of whom live below the poverty line. Between 40 and 60% of their income is from the collection and sale of non-timber forest produce. Similarly, landless, marginal, and small farmers rely heavily on common pastures for the fodder and water needs of their livestock. When commons are ecologically healthy, they improve surface and groundwater, soil nutrients, pollination, pest control, carbon storage, and create a thriving ecosystem. This healthy ecosystem helps improve the productivity and resilience of farms, forests, and pastures. This is essential in the face of the climate crisis. Commons are also woven into the social and cultural fabric of villages and provide a distinct social and cultural identity to rural communities. However, commons are degrading at an alarming rate. Widespread degradation of commons is worsening rural distress, especially impacting women. Agricultural yields are falling, costs of cultivation are rising, water tables are getting depleted, forests are shrinking, and pastures are degrading. These in turn contribute to declining rural incomes, growing inequality, distress migration, additional burden on women, and worsening the impacts of climate change. Communities, especially women, who depend on the forests, pastures, and water bodies around them, don't have the rights and resources to protect and manage these commons. The collective potential of local communities, particularly women, in the governance of commons, thus remains neglected. But today, there are opportunities to address these problems. At the national level, there is increasing attention for climate action, land restoration, and water conservation. Laws such as the Panchayati Raj Act and the Forest Rights Act support community-led commons restoration. State and national governments have made ambitious commitments on farmers' incomes, land degradation, and climate change, water availability, and sustainable development goals. In fact, state governments already spend about 40,000 crores INR or 5 billion USD every year on the restoration of natural resources under the Right to Employment Act. This is a huge opportunity to embed commons into government programs, since supporting decentralized community-led commons restoration can help governments meet these commitments. Barriers to change. To make the most of these opportunities, we need to first understand why efforts to restore commons so far have not quite succeeded. This is because of 4 deep-rooted problems. Problem number 1. People working on commons don't work together. Governments at all levels, NGOs, panchayat institutions, and other actors don't plan and implement in tandem. Because they work in silos, they fail to deliver concrete and lasting impact. Problem number 2. Actors with mandates to implement programs don't have capacity. The actors responsible for implementing programs don't have the capacity to plan and implement. They don't have enough information to make evidence-based decisions. Problem number 3. National or state governments and institutions provide weak support to commons restoration. Commons are widely and erroneously perceived as wastelands that should be put to other productive uses. Evidence that commons play important ecological and economic roles is not well known, which is why social and political interest in commons restoration remains low. Problem number 4. Actors responsible for implementing laws, policies, and programs are not held accountable. Laws, policies, and programs that support community rights, commons restoration, and women's representation exist, but there are no mechanisms in place to ensure that those responsible for implementing them are held accountable. Moreover, communities don't have the capacity or information to hold the different actors accountable. As a result, commons are often diverted for development projects. Women's right to representation and decision-making are also routinely ignored. Solution: when communities, especially women, are entrusted with the power to control and govern their commons, opportunities open up to sustainably increase rural incomes, promote women's participation in collective decision-making, and reap ecological dividends. This is the promise of the commons. Our successful core model works to advance the governance of commons by local communities with a 3-pronged approach. 1. Secure community land rights. 2. Collective and inclusive governance of commons. 3. Access to funds and other resources for restoration of commons. Evidence from our work on the ground shows that in over 3 to 5 years, commons become ecologically healthier, produce more food, fodder, and other useful materials, improve water availability, soil quality, and biodiversity. So farmers save on fertilizers, pesticides, and irrigation. Yields go up and farmers can grow a second crop as well. As a result, average household incomes increase by 30 to 50%. People spend more on food, health, and education. To achieve this kind of enduring change at scale, the Promise of Commons initiative will pursue 4 mutually reinforcing strategic action areas, with a focus on working with a range of partners to A. Catalyze collaborative action to build a shared and vivid imagination, improve access to data and knowledge, and enhance capacities to design and sustain multi-actor engagement. B. Co-create public assets and leverage technology and government programs architecture to build leadership and capacities at scale. C. Generate evidence, influence narratives and embed commons in programs and policies. And D. Engender institutional mechanisms that make government and other actors more responsive and accountable. To implement the 4 strategic action areas, we need to expand the coalition of the actors pushing for change in the system. A system where change is driven by local communities and where women in particular have the voice, agency, power, and influence to transform systems, institutions, and structures to address deep systemic inequalities and power imbalances. Government at all levels recognizes community stewardship on commons and creates enabling policies, programs, and institutional architecture. Private sector actors recognize the promise of commons for nature and people and invest in commons restoration. NGOs, networks, think tanks, academia, and media amplify voices of communities, particularly women and the disadvantaged, and support in generating evidence and enhancing capacities. Over the next 5 years, we aim to make substantial and measurable progress to achieve the long-term vision of gender equitable and inclusive community-led governance of the commons to improve ecological, social, and economic outcomes for rural people. We are confident that implementing our plan in the current window of time will help us deliver significant impact in 5 years. 38 million rural people, including 19 million women, will have secured rights to access, use, and manage 30 million acres of commons, improving their livelihoods and health of commons. 11 million rural people will benefit from the 50% improvement in stable net incomes that result from restored commons and better access to markets and social security schemes. This will set in motion a cascade of change, leading to the full realization of the promise of commons in the long term. 350 million rural poor enjoying improved economic and ecological outcomes from gender-inclusive community-led governance of 205 million acres of India's commons.
Great. We have a lot of questions that have come in. So the first one is, how does the Promise of Commons initiative contribute to SDGs, realization of SDGs? Can you talk about the specific SDGs that it addresses? And what strategies have you employed or are you employing to engage and empower local communities in the sustainable management of commons?
Yeah. So in commons or the Promise of Commons initiative that we are talking about, one is that it's not a project per se. It's a long-term initiative that we see. It's a collaborative initiative of NGOs, of government, of other practitioners, academicians. So it contributes, or it has the potential to contribute to 10 SDGs. So beginning with life on land, which is SDG 15. So as a lot of focus and some of the strategies that we have is working directly with the village communities and strengthening their collective power, strengthening their voice and agency for managing these resources. So some of the strategies that we have in place is to improve their access to different kinds of data, because a lot of times data is restricted, and even when there are programs, they're not able to implement it or tap into the potential of that program because of limited access to data and information technology tools. So one of the strategies is to improve their access to data, information, technology tools. So for example, there's an Android-based app which we've developed, which is called Composite Landscape Assessment Restoration Tool, which essentially enables the communities to identify which are the areas and what kind of biophysical initiatives can be undertaken in which part of their village to restore their landscapes. So this tool, it combines information from different secondary sources on considering the soil health, the topography, the lithology, the geology, and the slope and all, to give, say, some sort of a very simple representation of what kinds of initiatives can be undertaken in different kinds of areas. So enabling communities to access to access these kinds of tools that can help them in planning, that can help them in monitoring is one of the ways. The second strategy we have, as we saw in the video, is also catalyzing collaborative action. So one is bringing villages, communities from different villages onto a common platform, strengthening federations of institutions, facilitating platforms wherein communities come together, wherein you have also other actors, say for example, government officials also participating in these forums, wherein that provides a space for dialogue, for deliberation, for developing some sort of a shared imagination, and for negotiation, also influencing or exerting pressure onto what kind of works need to be done in their area. So that's the second strategy. And this is at different levels. So at the right from the village to say like the state level. Thirdly, a lot of focus is on strengthening evidence and improving the overall narrative around commons, because commons are generally, they are seen as wastelands and people do not even know about commons. They would identify with forests, they would identify with pastures or water bodies, but the concept of commons is not really well known, both as resource systems as well as institutional systems. So the idea is how do we generate more and more evidences around the importance of commons? How do we say make the connections between commons contribution to farming systems, to water security, to gender equality? How do we make those connections more visible and improve the overall narrative around commons? So yeah, these are some of the strategies. The other thing is also we collaborate with a lot of research institutions, especially to develop different kinds of research methods and tools and see how that can be used in the rural context to improve collective action and to trigger discussions around these resources. So for example, one of the methods that we have been using is experimental games, which draws a lot from game theory. And the other method is community-based system dynamics, which is also something that's being taken from the academia field, but is being used in the rural context. So using these kinds of tools, it helps in triggering discussions around the shared nature of these resources. So for example, there's a game on groundwater governance. And when the farmers play that game, at the end of the game, they say that we understand that water that we are extracting from this source of water it's a common resource, it's a shared resource. And also understanding the interlinkages between farming systems and between commons, or so those kind of connections become more visible. We're able to have discussions around what are the short-term impacts as well as what are the long-term impacts of the kinds of decisions that are being undertaken. So both at the community level as well as when we are engaging with policymakers and all. So yeah, I think, does that make sense?
Yeah. Prithvi, I wanted to ask you, you've been using these phrases, strengthening collaborative action and strengthening village communities throughout your presentation. Could you talk a little more about what it actually entails in practical terms? What are the challenges and what is the process that is involved in actually strengthening village communities?
Yeah. So a lot of times we are under the impression that village communities are homogeneous communities, right? But that is not so. Village communities are very heterogeneous communities. They are deep-rooted social inequalities. There are a lot of power imbalances that we see. There are inequalities in terms of the kind of decision-making power that women and men hold, or people from different caste groups in India, they hold in terms of access to resource and use to resource. So when we start working with these communities, the first thing that we do is talking to them and saying and setting the ground rules for establishing an institution for governing, for managing their commons. So one of the ground rules is that this kind of an institution should be based on principles of universal membership, wherein each and every adult in the village, irrespective of the caste, irrespective of their sex, they participate and they have an equal voice in that institution. So a lot of times, sometimes you would find opposition from the village communities, and they would say that no, we do not agree to your thing, and we do not want people from this particular community to participate in the decision making process. And then we would go from that village, we would work in a neighboring village, and then when they see the benefits, they would again invite us. So those kind of things also happen. But the idea is that one is building on the principles of universal membership. Secondly, what we also try to do is engage with them to understand what have been some of the institutional mechanisms through which they had managed their resources in the past. So trying to understand those kind of rules and regulations and institutional mechanisms which have been there, and discussing with them if those kind of institutional mechanisms can be revived, or in certain cases, if they are inadequate, if they do not consider the poor or say the livestock keepers or the gender interests into concern, then challenging them on those grounds, but mostly trying to build on those local rules and regulations which had existed in the past. So, and like somebody in the chat had also reflected that it shows a lot of similarity to Ostrom's design principles. So yes, we are inspired a lot by Eleanor Ostrom's institutional design principles. So the some of the principles that we adhere to when we are working with these communities is to define the boundaries. So working with them to define both the resource boundary, which as well as the user boundaries. So who has access to these resources, who does not have, and ensuring that it's not just the people of that particular village who have access to these resources and who have a role in the decision-making power, but also people from other villages, customary users as well. So these village institutions, then they evolve different kinds of rules and regulations, which are recorded in their village registers, which is kept with them. And they would record these rules and regulations. So for example, who has access, who does not have access, what are the harvesting mechanisms? So village communities in different areas, different geographies, they would have their own harvesting mechanisms for getting fodder, for getting NTFPs, for getting fuel wood, and then what kind of, if they do not follow those rules, then what kind of sanctioning mechanisms can be there. So we see these communities also evolving a lot of rules based on graduated sanctioning mechanisms. So there are rules like when the community breaks a particular rule for the first time, then they would just give a warning to that person. If it's done for 2 or 3 times, the second time, then it would be something like public shaming or some kind of a financial sanction will be imposed. So there are these different kinds of sanctioning mechanisms. We also constantly we challenge them and we engage with them to see that the rules and regulations that these communities have, are they pro-poor? Are they providing spaces for women, for people from the marginalized groups in that particular village to benefit from commons? So these are some of the kinds of institutional mechanisms that we have. The other thing that we do is also engaging with them to develop, say, like a shared vision of for their village. So often in the village, even so the youth would have some different sort of an imagination of what they would like their village to be. The older people would have different, men, women would see it differently. People from different occupations would see it differently. So bringing people together on a common platform, having discussions around these issues as to what is your imagination of how your village or how your landscape should be, and then working towards what needs to be done to achieve that shared imagination, to achieve that vision. So helping them develop these long-term plans, and which is then divided or which is then bifurcated into annual plans as to what can be done each year. Then identifying for which of the plans, in order to execute those plans, which are the actors that they need to engage with, where could the financial sources come from, which government programs can be helpful in implementing or in executing those plans. The other thing is also building a large or strengthening the local cadre. So identifying um, people within the village communities, both men and women, who have some sort of a skill and who might not be literate, but at least semi-literate, and enhancing their skills in planning, in management, so that they become resources for the village communities in the long run, and they become the voices and they for negotiating, for engaging with different government people. So yeah, these are some of the things that we do.
Thank you. You mentioned in your presentation that the promise of commons will result in a 30 to 50% increase in household incomes. Could you talk about the time period that you're looking at? Over how many years is this increase going to take place? And any sense as to what this additional income might be used for by the rural households?
Yes, so this is over a period of 5 to 7 years, and mostly the sources where the areas where they spend their income on, one is agriculture, for getting inputs for agriculture or livestock. So they would invest back in agriculture and livestock. Secondly, they would also invest in education, in healthcare facilities, so these are some of the areas, and besides also investing in, say, like cultural activities. So yeah, these are some of the areas where they spend their incomes on.
Challenges for commons may come from outside, but also from within. So in your case, after the land rights are secured, where are the most difficult challenges you face coming from the outside or inside the communities, from within the communities, especially in terms of building and implementing commons governance, and how do you deal with them?
Yeah, so commons are contested spaces. That's a given. And within the community also, you would find some most of the times powerful people um, encroaching or privatizing commons. And sometimes also the marginalized groups privatizing or coming onto commons because they do not have alternative sources of livelihood. So the challenge for us then becomes that how do you strengthen the collective power of people to evict encroachments wherein which are being done by the powerful people in the village. At the same time, how do you engage, or what kinds of conversations do you trigger so that communities are also sensitive to people who are very marginalized, and that's why they've encroached. So yes, there are contestations both within and outside. And basically, the whole idea behind Promise of Commons is also because of the kinds of challenges that we were facing from outside, that we thought that what we have been doing so far is not sufficient. Because what in few of the villages where we were working, we could see that that communities were able to restore their commons. They had their rights on commons. But when we look at the larger context, there are issues of mining, there are issues of industrialization. So a lot of land grabbing is happening. So in order to deal with those kinds of issues, we need to engage with several other actors who are there in the ecosystem. And that is what is Promise of Commons about. So bringing in different actors from different sectors, catalyzing interactions amongst themselves, and helping them or building those kinds of evidences that helps them see the connections or the importance of commons are some of the ways that we are trying to deal with it.
Yeah, thank you. So the next question is, how do you engage with a broad spectrum of community members and a broad spectrum of stakeholders? What are the strategies that you employ? And secondly, how do you ensure that communities are able to take ownership of the initiatives that you start? What do you do to ensure that communities take ownership and it's not left to FES to continue with the programs?
Yeah, so one of the first things that we, since the time we start engaging with the communities, we firstly define the roles and responsibilities of both the village community as well as FES. So there is sort of a TOR that is signed between the village community and FES as to what will the village community do, what is their role, what is the role that they see for themselves, and what is it that they would expect FES to do. And so, and also a lot of these, we see our role just as facilitators. So just convening people on a common platform, asking them questions, important questions, sharing information, sharing data with them. But the platform is theirs. They have to decide what is it that they would like to do. And what are the most pressing challenges that they have. They are the ones who have to define those challenges, who have to say sort of also identify and decide onto what could be the alternatives that they would like to have to address those challenges. Our role is just as a facilitator, wherein we provide them data, information, bringing them together. Yeah.
Right. Thank you. And last question, if you can circle back to the conversation about Ostrom's design principles, what are the challenges in actually realizing them on the ground? So what I'm trying to ask is, what is the difference between the reality of those design principles and the theory of it?
So, I mean, in theory, it's mostly on paper. It's easier written than it's done in practice. That is there. Even and right from the first design principle, which is on defining the boundaries, that in itself is a very challenging principle, because you have there might be, when you go to a village, people might not even know where their commons are. There would be only few people in the village who would know. A lot of times these commons are encroached, as in you would find some other person who is staying on those common lands, or who is practicing agriculture on those common lands. And it's not easy to evict that, and FES cannot evict that encroachment, right? It's the communities who have to evict that. So having those kinds of negotiations with the communities, discussions with the communities, and how the community exerts pressure on those individuals, that is one. The other thing is also, there are a lot of ones when as long as the resource is degraded, probably there's not much of interest attached to it. But when people start seeing that the resource condition is getting improved, then you would find several claimants. So then they would say that this is ours, or this is something that we have been also using. So the basic, I think, idea is, on the first principle itself, is when we are defining these boundaries, we ask them questions like, who are also the customary users, not just the people who are within the village, who are also the customary users, so that their interests are also included in this when they're forming this institution. Yeah, so that is just one example. I don't know. I think we're running out of time, maybe. So yeah, maybe we could connect separately to discuss more on that.
Yeah. With that, we come to the end of today's talk. Thank you very much, Pratiti. That was a really impressive and all-encompassing talk, and it was very enlightening. Full disclosure, I myself have worked with FES for about 6 to 7 years. So I'm also an alumnus of the Foundation of Ecological Security. So next week, we are going to have Dr. David Beck, who's going to be talking about US policies on indigenous communities. He is currently a fellow at he's a visiting scholar at the East-West Center, and he'll be talking about US federal policies on towards indigenous communities in this country. So thank you very much, one and all, for taking the time out to participate in this talk. We are deeply appreciative of the time that you have taken out to come and attend this. I would also like to appreciate Carolyn, Alicia, Takako, and Justina for helping us putting together this show. So, and that